Hi everyone, today my group and I are going to talk about the research on probing theoretically into Central and Eastern Europe with a focus on transactions, resources, and institutions. So, the development of alternative theoretical perspective is very important for the IB research, and the research on Central and Eastern Europe provides an interesting way for developing and testing theories because the transition processes provide a series of unique societal quasi experiments. This paper specifically talks about the unique opportunities presented by Central and Eastern Europe to identify hidden features and assumptions when conducting research in mature market economies. In this presentation, we will be specifically focusing on organizational economic theory, resource-based theory, and institutional theories. So these three theories, among many others, have emerged as leading perspectives. Whether a particular theory gains widespread acceptance depends on its continuity, novelty, and scope. So CE research and organizational economic theory probably display the highest degree of continuity as displayed in the table because they are basically applied to a new setting. On the other hand, the research-based theories also display some continuity by drawing on existing work developed elsewhere. On the contrary, institutional theories as employed in the CE research seem to have a relatively low degree of continuity by pushing factors usually considered as background in IB and management research to the front stage. However, they offer the highest degree of novelty in this highly unusual and novel context. Moreover, scholars have also aimed at incorporating institutions into theories because of the importance of their contextual influences. Now, next ahead, whereas transaction cost theory and agency theory are relatively well established before CE's transitions, the resource-based theories and institutional theory represent more recent theoretical developments whose emergence approximately coincides with the rising scholarly interest in CE. So moving on, we're going to outline these strategic issues in three areas. So the first one is the foreign entrance, which basically states that CE research focuses on motives and entry strategies of foreign entrants. And in parallel, researchers have also analyzed challenges facing entrants after the initial entry, such as knowledge transfer in joint ventures, cross-cultural management in foreign-owned businesses, and post-acquisition researching. The second strategic issue is for the local incumbents, which also includes the privatized firms and state-owned enterprises. So the research states that local incumbents has primarily been concerned with the challenges associated with restructuring, including governance structures and business cultures. The third strategic issue, which is with the newly established local firms, states that entrepreneurship is a relatively new phenomenon in the Central and Eastern Europe, and only recent researchers have begun to analyze the determinants of new firm establishment and their survival. Next ahead, we are going to talk about the organizational economic theory in the transition context. So organizational economic theory, such as the transaction cost theory and the agency theory, have been developed with the assumption of relatively static, well-developed market mechanisms. However, in the institutional framework, such an assumption would not hold true. For example, in the transaction cost theory research that associates intangible assets with the market failure, yet, in the transition economies, markets for tangible assets such as real estate are also subject to high transaction costs. As depicted in the table, one of the major challenges in the transition context is that transaction costs are particularly high owing to the weak institutions and high uncertainty. So there's a need for better direct and indirect measures, that is, what contextual influences drive the transaction costs. Moreover, transaction costs vary across markets in different ways than in the mature market economies. So there's a need to measure transaction costs across countries, industries, and industry segments within the region. Additionally, the agency relationships are complex and vaguely defined, especially in the private enterprises. So it is expected for managers as agents to comply with the interests of enterprise owners as principals. However, in reality, it is difficult to ensure that managers actually comply. So there's a need to capture both formal and informal sources of power governing principal-agent relationship and include the power of various stakeholders, including board members and employees, into the picture. So next ahead, we'll be talking about the foreign investors' entry strategies. The transaction cost analysis of entry strategy essentially argues that the decision over governance mechanism, such as the entry mode choice, requires a rational trade-off between the transaction costs and with the hierarchy modes. Moreover, the lower transaction cost of establishing local operations make it more likely for a foreign investor to have a wholly owned operation rather than joint ventures or a contractual cooperation. Thus, the transaction cost of the establishment were a stronger deterrent than the potentially high coordination costs in the joint ventures. Other studies in the paper have also explored how the high transaction costs may deter FDI altogether. So, for example, weak intellectual property rights and thus high enforcement costs deter FDI in high technology sectors, but do not deter FDI in sales and distributions. So overall, this research provides a finer grained understanding of which forms of institutional shortcomings are most likely to raise the transaction costs. Thus, the transaction cost theory-based research in CE has redirected its focus from firm-specific variables to the contextual variables that moderate transaction costs in specific markets. Next ahead in the Central and Eastern Europe research, agency theory has not only served as an analytical tool but has also informed key political decisions in the reform process. While privatization seems to have improved companies' performance in almost all the developed and middle income countries, the record is really low in the transition economies because of weaker institutional development. Additionally, many domestically owned CE firms did not fundamentally change their strategies or structure, and that is the reason why we are talking about the incumbents restructure strategies. So to address these problems, it is now widely recognized that privatization in itself is insufficient and that the creation of effective systems of governance is necessary to improve the enterprise's performance. In contrast to a straightforward set of principal-agent relationship as portrayed by the agency theory, a wide range of stakeholders such as employees and government authorities have an influence on the corporate decisions in CE. Thus, a key challenge for governance research is to develop theoretical tools to analyze the influence of the relevant institutions, hierarchies, stakeholders, and control mechanisms in privatized enterprises.
In this slide, we'll talk about resource-based theories in a transition context. Resource-based theories focus on idiosyncratic resources and capabilities as drivers of firm performance. In this discussion, along with resource-based view, we also include organizational learning theories, evolutionary theories, and dynamic capabilities. What are some of the key challenges for applying RBTs? First is identifying which resources constitute a basis for competitive advantage in a transition context, since context plays an important role in determining the way firms manage the resources. Then comes the process of developing, transferring, and exploiting resources in a transition context, which calls for a new measures to capture these dynamics. While the basic RIO criteria, value, rarity, immutability, and organization would apply in theory, but the types of actual resources that fulfill these criteria are different. In the next slide, we talk about what are some of the foreign investors' entry strategies. Some of the modes to enter international market include exporting, licensing, joint ventures, and FDI. RBTs have been applied to analyze how foreign entrants can manage their JVs, including issues such as partner selection, organizational learning, and post-acquisition restructuring. One of the crucial aspects is resource complementarity. It is the degree to which two partner firms symmetrically contribute dissimilar resources in terms of both type and amount to an alliance. Though it is crucial for the success of JVs and acquisition, yet the question is what resources are complementary. In a rapidly changing environment, local firms need to reconfigure their resources and thereby they form alliances with MNEs that have financial assets, technical capabilities, and marketing savvy. On the other hand, foreign investors seek primarily local partners that help them to gain access to local markets. Beyond the specific country, MNEs may also involve in indirect exporting. The key aspect of complementarity is a good organizational fit between two acquiring and target firms. It seems contradictory when Allenbrook and De Castro find that the higher the degree of organizational fit between SOE targets, and their Western acquirers, the worse the post acquisition performance is. Several studies also point out that to make a JV or an acquisition work in CEE often requires massive resource transfers from the foreign parent, and it is a major determinant of business performance. Due to the need for new financial resources, many acquisitions after a few years resemble a phenomenon called brownfield. A brownfield is when a company or government entity purchases or leases existing production facilities to launch a new production activity. It is interesting to know how foreign investors facilitate organizational learning in JVs and acquired firms in CEE. According to Lyles and co-authors, the capabilities to learn from partners are tacit resources to gain competitive advantage. The market-based capabilities can be transferred from M&E parents and learned by the JVs. Such learning results in new ways of doing business, but also requires some unlearning of existing routines that are not favorable under the new circumstances. So, what are some of the reasons behind such acquisitions? The first question to ask would be which locally held resources induce foreign investors to acquire a firm, even though they have to engage in costly deep restructuring and invest considerable additional resources to create a competitive entity? So, the second question is how can acquirers manage the massive restructuring in brownfield acquisitions without falling into the traps of variation in managerial control or isolation of local managers and employers? Well, the integration may be complicated by large differences in organizational cultures, structures, and processes, especially in acquisitions related to privatization. Therefore, some authors emphasize to retain and develop local resources, whereas others show how radical change can be successful. Overall, the need for extensive knowledge transfer and deep restructuring is widely acknowledged. Moving on to the next slide, we see what are some of the important restructuring strategies post acquisition. RBT research has addressed two aspects of the restructuring. To what extent can inherited resources provide a basis for competitiveness? The second is how can firms reorganize and enhance their resources in order to become market competitive? Research suggests that the first aspect, inherited resources, may be important for success in the transition. Under conditions of radical environmental change, firms' resources are better predictors of corporate performance than organizational variables. The East German Zs in Jena, for instance, has developed distinct capabilities and a moderately successful export record. Among inherited resources, leadership is a very important resource. Even though the inherited resources are of potential value, they still have to be reorganized. Further, Newman's case analysis showed that with weak absorptive capacity, a very big learning gap may actually inhibit organizational change. Consequently, the cognitive ability of manager and employees is limited for radical changes. In other words, internal consistency and strategic flexibility are key to successful change process. Organizational theories implicitly assumes that resources can be recombined in varying proportions, such as to optimize a production function. However, studies show that the organizational change may require significant efforts of unlearning before firms can embark on successful new learning. So, thereby, RPTs may be more suitable than organizational economic theories to analyze change processes. In this slide, we'll talk about entrepreneurs' entry and growth strategies. The importance of new firm creation for economic transition and growth is widely acknowledged, yet entrepreneurship is still a very young field of research in CEE. Although there are enough opportunities for startups throughout the region, the actual number of people engaged in entrepreneurial activity is lower in CEE than in countries at similar levels of income. That makes us question why is it lower in CEE countries? It could be because of the less resources and also the need for entrepreneurial traits like a strong achievement orientation, a strong locus of control, and a high risk taking propensity. Entrepreneurs need human and financial capital to initiate and develop their startups. The bigger question arises when entrepreneurs focus on international markets, whether entrepreneurs have access to suitable complementary resources. These observations are based on single country studies, but the process of resource accumulation and exploitation by entrepreneurs during the transition are not well understood.
So, I'll be talking about the institution based theory in a transition context. Institutions are typically defined as the rules of the game, which include formal rules, laws and regulations, and informal constraints, customs, norms, and cultures. Central Eastern European researchers increasingly realize that institutions are much more than background conditions, and institutions help in determining and implementing strategies to create competitive advantage. The institution transition sweeping Central Eastern Europe defined as fundamental and a comprehensive change introduced to the formal and informal rules of the game that affect organization as a player. So in this slide, I'll be talking about the foreign investors entry strategy. First one being the formal rules, which include permissible range of entry strategies and set the stage for possible bargaining between investors and authorities. Second one being the informal institutions, such as norms and values that moderate the transaction cost and affect the entry decisions. Secondly, even the decision makers' personal emotions are influenced by informal institutions and have been shown to influence the foreign investments. Third one being the acquisition. In Central Eastern Europe, the institutions surrounding privatization set the context for foreign acquisition strategies. For instance, industry-specific regulations and conditions for tenders to exploit natural resources influence the investor strategy and the acceleration of their commitment. Third one being the background. In case of formal market supporting institutions, which are less well developed and informal constraints dominate, the foreign entrants are more likely to use joint ventures and alliances as opposed to wholly owned subsidiaries to enter Central Eastern Europe. Lastly, its operations. Operations across cultural boundaries are impacted by institutional variances. For example, in Russia, teamwork combined with group-based reward systems has a positive effect when applied to non-managerial employees, but not for managers. This may be due to the traditional hierarchical structure of Central Eastern European managers and its discouragement of taking risk and responsibility. So in this slide, I'll be talking about the incumbent restructuring strategies. First one being the local incumbent, East versus West perspective, differences in national culture as a result of institutional differences. For example, workers in Eastern Germany show less initiative at work than their Western German counterparts. And people in Czech Republic show lower level of willingness to take risk relative to those to their US peers. Second one being the bloc culture, distinct institutional characteristics in transition economies. For example, Central Eastern European organizations are highly particularistic rather than universalist. That is, employees are rewarded based on who they are and what the relationship they have with the person in power, rather than on some universal merit-based general rule. Third one being the informal institutions. Central Eastern European research demonstrate a major culture upheaval with Western culture represented by marketing, media and consultant, a phenomena called collective culture shock. Fourth one being the network-based strategies. The Central Eastern European managers tend to resort to personal connections to achieve organizational goals. And the last one being the growth strategies, which include generic expansion calls for an internal supply of resources, such as capital, technology, and managers, mergers and acquisition that require functioning strategic factor market, and last, developing networks and alliances need to build trust and mutual understanding. So in this slide, I'll be talking about the entrepreneur entry and growth strategy. Even after overcoming the barriers of entry, entrepreneurs have to operate without effective formal market supporting institutions, which create a major obstacle in a wide range of informal institutions, which include tax and regulatory burden combined with plunder by the numerous tax and regulatory authorities and incumbent use of authorities to erect barriers against new entries. Like privatized incumbent firms, many newly established firms seek informal institutional support, which include personal network, informal credit, and bartering to substitute for formal institutions such as court. As a result, entrepreneurial networking in transition economies has been noted to be intensified, as smaller firms are disproportionately affected by market imperfections. They often have to intensify their networking activities. Lastly, Central Eastern Europe is approaching West European level in terms of growth strategies, but with crucial exceptions. If you see down in the table, Romania takes 97 days and 54% of per capita GDP to set up a new business, wherein Denmark, which is in West Europe, only takes 3 days and 11% of GDP to set up a new business. So, in conclusion, the transaction cost theory and agency theory research face a context where some of their standard assumptions do not apply. This requires finer graded modeling of incentives and agency relationships. Second, the resource-based theory research may explore which resources are most crucial and may analyze the adaptation of resources. At a more general level, the creation, transfer, and exploitation of resources during radical change merits analysis grounded in an evolutionary perspective. Third, more analysis on the impact of institutions on individual and firm behavior. More broadly, we believe that the transaction cost theory, the resource based theory, and the institution based view of business strategy is likely to contribute to the global strategy research agenda. Thank you.